Welcome to the Resilient Retail Game Plan, a podcast for anyone wanting to start, grow or scale a profitable creative product business with me, Catherine Eardley. The Resilient Retail Game Plan is a podcast dedicated to one thing, breaking down the concepts and tools that I've gathered from 20 years in the retail industry and showing you how you can use them in your business. This is the real nuts and bolts of running a successful product business, broken down in an easy, accessible way. This is not a podcast about learning how to make your business look good. It's the tools and techniques that will make you and your business feel good. Confidently plan, launch and manage your products, and feel in control of your sales numbers and cash flow to help you build a resilient retail business. Hello there, and welcome to episode 34 of the Resilient Retail Game Plan. My name's Catherine Eardley, and I'm the host as well as the founder of the Resilient Retail Club, which is my membership group for creative product businesses. I'm so excited about this episode. It's a really special episode because I'm going to go through some of the results of the product business survey that I ran for 2 to 3 weeks during March 2021, where I asked product business owners, in total there were 309 who responded. I asked them about the realities of what it's really like running a product business in 2021. And I got very specific. It was an anonymous survey. Can't say that word. An anonymous survey. It asked them some very detailed questions about turnover, conversion rates, average order values, number of orders they were getting a week, all of that and more. And that's what we're going to be diving into today. So why did I run this survey? Well, I ran the survey because, frankly, there just aren't that many benchmarks out there. A lot of the people that I was working with, a lot of clients, a lot of club members were asking me, or I felt often they were feeling that maybe they weren't doing as well as they should be doing. They maybe had unrealistic expectations. There's a lot of narratives out there in terms of building 6-figure businesses or 7-figure businesses. And I felt like it had really obscured some of the reality of what it's really like running a product business. And that's what I wanted to dig into. I'd run a survey something like this, a little bit less detailed, in 2019, in fact. That one had about 50 respondents, and this one's much bigger, so I had over 300 respondents. And I was really interested to see if some of the patterns that I'd seen, particularly about people paying themselves and that kind of thing, to see whether or not they were still holding true in 2021. Now, I've a total of 3 podcast episodes on this survey. I'm going to be covering the numbers this week. Next week, I'm going to be talking more in detail about marketing. And then the week after that, I'm going to go through a really fascinating couple of questions that we asked people at the end. One of which was, what was the one big thing that made a difference? And one of which was, what's the one thing that you wish you'd known earlier, or the big learning that you would take away from running your business? So there's lots of really fascinating, juicy details to get our teeth into. I will say, though, that these podcasts, even though I'm doing 3 separate podcast episodes on the survey, I still don't think I'm going to get a chance to go through all of the detail. So if you want to get your hands on this report, then go to resilientretailclub.com/survey, and you'll be able to download your free PDF of the report, which will give you all of the ins and outs and everything that I can't cover in full detail in the podcast. There's so much good information in here. There's so many ways that you as a product business owner can really understand what it's really like, what the reality is of running a business. I've done lots of scenarios where I've looked at things by the age of the business. So not just saying this is how many orders people are getting, but this is how it breaks down by the age of the business, for example. There's really a lot of information that if you want to go and download it, benchmark yourself against some of these industry numbers, then you're going to be able to do so. So as I said, although I'm doing 3 separate podcast episodes, I promise you there's even more to be had in the report, whether it's the effect of COVID on businesses or how they feel about the support that they've had, to so much more detail, how much it's costing them to start the business or how much their running costs are. There's so much more at resilientretailclub.com/survey. So let's get started. First off, a quick note about who filled out the survey. So I've told you there were 300 businesses, but I want to tell you a little bit more about the types of businesses who were filling it in. It was very interesting to see the results broken down by the people who had completed it. For example, one of the first questions I asked was the age of the business. So the biggest group of people were businesses who'd been running for 1 to 3 years. Over 5 years was the next biggest category at around 24%. So about a quarter of respondents have been running for over 5 years. About a fifth have been running for 3 to 5 years. About 20% had been going for under a year. And then a small number had not yet started. So the majority, I'd say, then about 80% of businesses had been going for at least a year, and quite a large number of them had been going for 5 years. So these are experienced business owners who answered the survey. In terms of how the businesses got their stock, I wanted to understand a little bit more about the different business models, to understand who was answering and to see if the business model, for example, had impact on some of the elements. The most common type of business were businesses that sold products they made themselves, so 61%, which I suppose you might consider the maker community, so handmade products. And then 40% sold products made by outsourcing the production, and 24% sold products from other retailers that they'd bought at wholesale. So the reason that's more than 100% is because people could tick as many as applied to them, and a lot of people got their products from a variety of sources. It was not uncommon at all to see people who made some products, wholesaled or bought from other retailers for some more, and then maybe had some of their range outsourced as well. So there was a lot of people who mixed. There were a very small number of vintage and secondhand businesses, probably about 2% of the sellers, and then drop shipping businesses were around 3%. So predominantly makers, manufacturers, and people purchasing products from other retailers. Then in terms of where people were selling, so 88% of businesses were selling via their own website. I was actually surprised that it wasn't almost 100%, but typically those who were not selling on their own website were selling via a combination of Etsy and physical events, when of course we can have physical events. So 88% on their own website. Around 42% of people were selling on Etsy, which is probably slightly higher than I was expecting. I thought that was really interesting to see how nearly half of these businesses were Etsy sellers. Fairs and events, as I said, during non-lockdown times, that was about 40% of people selling there. And then about a third of people were wholesalers. And there was also quite a few different marketplaces that people were selling on as well, but the really the most significant one was Etsy by a long shot. Not on the high street, for example, which was the next biggest marketplace that people were mentioning, was around 10% of people. On average, businesses were selling across 3.2 selling channels. So again, in the same way that people were often getting their products from lots of different places, they were also selling them in lots of different places too. So then the types of the products that people were selling, I had to do a little bit of grouping here, a little bit of analysis on actually the kinds of products people were at, or the kind of businesses that people were based on the products that they were selling. Again, it was tick boxes and ticking as many as were relevant really for people, which meant that on average, about people were selling across maybe 2.7 different types of products. So by different types, I was breaking out, for example, kids wear versus women's wear versus jewellery versus stationery versus food and drink, etc., etc. What I found was the majority of people, the biggest grouping was about 28% of businesses who I would categorize as a lifestyle business. So a lifestyle business was somebody who was selling multiple products. So if they were selling homewares, but they were also selling jewellery and they were also selling clothing, that was the kind of business that I would assign as a lifestyle business. So it went 28% lifestyle, 20% clothing, about 13% home, 10% stationery, about 8% jewellery, and then around just under 5% who I would call gift businesses. They were the businesses who only picked gifts. Interestingly enough, gifts as a product category was probably the biggest product category. So I think it was about 40 or 45% of the businesses who responded, many of which ended up in that lifestyle category, they were also selling gifts as well. So it was a very common type of product to be selling. Bricks and mortar stores, incidentally, made up around 12% of the people who responded, and they were selling on average about 7 different types of products. So you can see that automatically bricks and mortar stores had a wider product selection in most cases. And now on to some of the real nitty gritty. So one of the first things that I asked people was to share how much they had turned over in their business in the past 12 months in terms of their top line sales. And what I found was that the biggest category by far, 40% of respondents, had sales that were under £10,000 a year. And then it went up from there. So around 20% had sales of between 10 and 25,000. 11% were in the 25 to 50,000, and then 11% in 50 to 100, with a smaller percentage, so 9.7% were in the 100 to 250,000. If you go to resilientretailclub.com/survey, download the report. This is figure 4, the turnover figure. You can see all of the detail there in a lovely pie chart, even if I say so myself. What was interesting about this then was that, again, if we go back to a lot of this messaging being about building your six-figure business, etc., then only around 13% of those surveyed, or about 40 businesses out of the 309, only about 13% fit into this category of six-figure businesses. And that the reality was 73% of businesses were on a turnover of under £50,000. So if you're one of those businesses sitting there, especially in that sort of 25 to 50, 50 to 100 bracket, feeling like, I keep hearing all of this, then just know that actually compared to an average for a business, then you're doing pretty well. The other thing as well to say about that is really the impact of the age of the business, because what I wanted to do with the survey more than anything was not just to pull out the overall numbers, but was to then break it down a little bit further and look at the impact of things like time and age on turnover, because that's the kind of thing that it's sometimes hard to see unless you really drill in. So what was really striking, and again, if you're in the report itself, then I've got this, it's figure 6, it's the turnover split out by the age of business. I think this is a really interesting one. And if you're a product business who's looking to benchmark yourself against turnover figures, I would definitely go and take a look at this chart, because I think it just shows so clearly the impact of time on businesses. It's not something I think we talk about enough. I think often when we talk about our businesses, we focus on all of these different things that we can be doing, which of course is really important. But sometimes the most important thing that we can do is keep going and keep being consistent and keep showing up. And then over time, that is what helps us grow. And this chart really illustrates that. So for example, over 80% of businesses who've been running for under a year were making less than £10,000. That number drops every time as you move from the under the year category. Then the people who've been running for 1 to 3 years, then 43% of them have a turnover of under £10,000, and 22% of businesses who've been running for 3 to 5 years, and then about 21% of businesses who've been running for over 5 years. So clearly it shows that, yes, there are businesses that even after 5 years have these lower turnovers who are under £10,000. I mean, who knows? Another thing that I look at later on in the report is the impact of full-time versus part-time workers. So, for example, you can see that has a big impact on turnover as well. Clearly, some people who've been running for 5 years, if they're doing it as a side business, their turnover is going to be lower than people who've been running it full-time for 5 years. But just the impact of time in itself is really striking on the graph. You can see that as you move really from the under a year into the 1 to 3, then the distribution of people's turnover really starts shifting. And then 3 to 5 is where you see quite a clear spread across the different turnovers. So it's not exactly a startling revelation, but I think it's a really important factor to keep in mind, because, again, if you consider that one of the hardest things that we do as business owners is work with our own mindset and our self-belief, is that if we realise that actually, 80% of businesses in their first year turn over less than £10,000, then that's a great place to start, and to know that actually keeping going and keeping consistent and keep showing up is one of the best ways to keep moving your business forward. Another question that I asked, that I was curious about, was not just where people were selling, but understanding where their top performing sales channel was. This is really just about getting a sense of, sometimes people say to me things like, is there a secret channel, or is there a secret place that I should be selling that will really help me move my business forward? So not surprisingly, 44% of people said that their own website was their highest or their primary sales channel, which is kind of interesting if you figure that 88% of people have a website, and for 44% of them, so only half of them, that was their main selling channel. Of course, I'm a big advocate for selling on your own website. I believe that's what helps you grow a long-term relationship with your customers and also allows you to do things like run your email marketing. I was actually surprised that it was only half of the businesses that sold on their own website that was their primary sales channel. Although that said, I do think that, especially when businesses are starting out and you're working really, really hard to drive that traffic to your website, I can imagine that, especially at the beginning, it may not be your primary channel. The next biggest channel after their own website was Etsy. So for about 17% of people, Etsy was their biggest sales channel. About 9% of people said their own bricks and mortar stores. And then about 9% of people as well were saying that the physical events or shows that they went to were their main selling channel. And then about 6% of people said that wholesale, that was the next most significant one. So about 6% of people found that wholesale was their main selling channel. But by far, the biggest selling channel that was the most successful for people was their own website. There's so much more in the report in terms of sales statistics. I looked at conversion rate, I looked at average order value, and I looked at the effect on conversion rate of time and how conversion rate shifted according to the average order value. So again, I'm not going to run through all of this in the podcast, otherwise I feel like I'm literally just going to be reading numbers out to you, and you're going to come away from this episode and be like, what was that? So do head over, as I said, resilientretailclub.com/survey and download it, and you can read it in all its glory. The next thing that I wanted to talk about in this episode, though, was something that I find really fascinating, and that is looking at how much product business owners pay themselves. The reason that I wanted to run these numbers was because turnover is one thing. So it's very interesting to look at turnover numbers. It's very interesting to look at the number of orders that people are getting per week from their business. But ultimately, it doesn't give you the whole story. As I said, a lot of this messaging that we hear about building a certain size of a business, they're always talking about the turnover numbers. So what I wanted to do was dig a little bit deeper. And instead of just focusing on turnover, I wanted to actually ask product business owners how much they pay themselves. I asked them specifically about salary. Now, if people have limited companies and they are company directors, then for typical businesses, it may be that you pay yourself partly salary and that you pay yourself some dividends as well at the end of the year. I did have a separate question in for company directors about dividends, and I would say about 98% of the people who responded, who were company directors, were not paying themselves any dividends. So from that, we can assume that the salary numbers that I'm about to run you through are pretty much reflective of how much people are actually paying themselves. It's not like they're paying themselves a salary plus there's a top up. As I said, that only about 2% of product business company directors, for people who have limited companies, about 2% of them were paying themselves some dividends. Some of them were paying quite generous dividends, especially the ones who are also paying themselves quite a generous salary. So it's not to say that company directors don't pay themselves from their product businesses. It is just a question of, when we're talking about salary, we are talking about the reality for most people that this is the only income they're taking from the product business. So when I asked this question as a top line, so how much are you currently able to pay yourself from your product business per month on average, then the biggest answer was that 43.4% of people do not take a salary from their business. I'd previously run a similar, slightly less detailed survey than this a couple of years ago, as I said, so I was aware that a large proportion of business owners didn't pay themselves. In fact, I have to say, I thought these results were slightly better than I'd expected based on previous research. But nonetheless, 43.4% of business owners were not taking any salary, and 80.7% of business owners were paying themselves £1,000 a month or less. There was just 6% who were paying themselves between £2,000 and £5,000 a month, and just one respondent, or 0.3% of all answers, who were paying themselves over £5,000. They were also paying themselves a generous dividend. So when I asked people where they wanted to be, just to really see kind of a bit of what were people's expectations or what were their desires in terms of being able to pay themselves, 38% of people wanted to be making £2,000 or above per month, compared to the 6% who actually were. When I pull these numbers, what I didn't want to do, or what I didn't want people to take away from this, is because obviously it could be that if you're starting out or you're thinking about running a business, or you've been running a business for a couple of years and you hear these statistics, I don't want it to feel like, okay, well, what's the point? or that this feels really negative, or this feels like, am I even in the right business? Because I think, if anything, what it showed me, both for turnover but also for how much people were paying themselves, was that time is a major factor. So people at the very beginning of their businesses are likely to be paying themselves less, and they're likely to be making less overall. But that there are some really great success stories, if you like, or there are really, whichever age of the business, there are businesses that are able to pay themselves, and there are businesses whose turnover has grown significantly. Obviously, when we come to the episode, the kind of one big thing that shifted that, I think it'd be really interesting to dig into then, well, what were some of those things that shifted things for these businesses? But I think that that's really what I want to take away from it. I mean, it sounds kind of, when you say, it sounds dramatic. If I say 80% of business owners paying themselves £1,000 a month or less, I think it's important to remember that there's a variety of experiences for different businesses, and that it's always worth looking at your own business and where you can improve it. But again, keeping in mind that you're probably doing better than you feel like you're doing. Again, keeping going that time is such an important, crucial element for people as they grow their businesses and they grow the amount of money that they pay themselves. So I ran, again, the analysis looking at the impact of the age of the business on people's salary. I was really curious to see what that was. As with the turnover, it is clear that time is a big factor on whether or not founders are taking a salary. So 65% of businesses who had been running for less than a year were not paying themselves at all, compared to the average of 43%. Now, it was surprising that even over 5 years, there were still businesses, so about a fifth of business owners who'd been running for more than 5 years and were still not paying themselves. So I think that did make me just kind of ask the question. It's definitely worth something thinking about for those business owners who don't currently pay themselves. I am a big believer that paying yourself from your business is partly about the numbers, but it's also about being committed and committing to yourself that you're going to start paying yourself. So interestingly, that under a year, there are businesses, for sure, there are a third of all business owners are paying themselves. So is it that their turnovers are way higher than some of the other businesses who've been running for longer? Or is it that the founders have made that commitment to pay themselves early on? I'm also a big believer in, if you commit to paying yourself, then it can often mean that your business is run more effectively, because you just don't have the extra money that you have to put into stock or into things that maybe don't work out to be for your best advantage. So that is my challenge to you. If you're listening to this and you don't currently pay yourself, yes, over time, more and more business owners are able to pay themselves, but part of that's going to be about you making that commitment to yourself. Yes, it's time. I'm going to start paying myself a salary. So, for example, when you looked at the business owners who did pay themselves a salary, the largest proportion of them, the biggest group of people who responded to this question, started paying themselves within a year of the business starting. So again, not necessarily going to be that they were paying that much at the beginning, but being committed that you're going to pay yourself something from the business, that it's going to reward you financially, is so important. And I honestly believe that it is as much about the mindset as it is about the money. And the final element that I looked at in the terms of the amount of money that people were paying themselves was the impact of turnover. So I wanted to see that as turnover shifted, whether or not more and more business owners were paying themselves. it was really interesting to see because, again, and it's also really helpful if you want to benchmark yourself against how much you're paying yourself, then it may be worth looking at the graph that will tell you the salary split by business turnover in the last 12 months to give you an idea of where you fit compared to other businesses at the same size as you. 70% of businesses who are making under £10,000 a year were not paying themselves a salary. That was the biggest proportion of any turnover bracket. And it makes sense that as your turnover increases, then your ability to pay yourself also increases. However, it's just worth noting that there were a couple of sort of outliers. So there were people who were making under £10,000 a year who were actually paying themselves a salary each month. So again, going back to this idea that you can commit and pay yourself even when the business is in the early stages. And equally, there were people who had businesses that were, for example, in the £50,000 to £100,000 bracket. So actually 11% of businesses in the £50,000 to £100,000 turnover bracket were not paying themselves. So again, if you're sitting there thinking, right, I'll pay myself when the business gets to this age or when it hits this turnover, know that for some people, that obviously that boundary just keeps rolling out and they just keep going, okay, well, I'll pay myself at the next point or the next point. So it's about being really strict with yourself and saying, I am going to commit to pay myself regardless of whether I think my business is in the quote unquote right place or not right now. Okay, that was the end of my rant about product business owners paying themselves. Those are some of the top line figures from the report. As I said, there is so much more detail. I just didn't want this episode to be a huge, long list of statistics that I was reading out to you. I wanted to pull out some of the key facts. So you now have a really good sense of the kind of turnover that is average for a product business, that the kind of salaries that people were paying themselves or the number of business owners that weren't paying themselves and how that shifts according to the age of the business or the turnover. There's so much more detailed information, as I said, at resilientretailclub.com/survey. So go ahead, get your copy, make yourself a cup of tea and sit and look through it and take a look, see how it sits with you and your business. How do you feel when you look at it? Does it make you feel relieved? Did you feel like, actually, do you know what? This is really positive. I'm actually doing better than I thought. Or were there any things that really kind of made you think twice or made you that you were surprised about when you looked at compared to your own business? I would love to know. Do come over to Instagram at Resilient Retail Club and say hi, send me a DM, show me where you're listening to the podcast or shoot me a message and tell me what you took away from the report. I'd love to know. Come back and join me next week where I'm going to be talking about marketing in a product business and what the results showed in terms of how long people were spending, how many people are running paid ads and the impact on their business. As always, if you have a moment to rate and review the podcast, then it's just so helpful to me. And otherwise, I will see you next week. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, then I invite you to check out resilientretailclub.com. The Resilient Retail Club is the membership for anyone wanting to start, grow or scale a profitable product business. No more trawling Google trying to find the answers to your questions or wading through general business advice that speaks mainly to service-based businesses. Whether you're still at the idea stage or you've been going for a while but want to get more focused and organised when it comes to your business, the Resilient Retail Club is the place for you. With a library of courses tailored to creative product businesses, several live sessions a month, and a supportive and active community, the Resilient Retail Club is the perfect membership to help you hit your goals faster. Check it out at resilientretailclub.com.